It was the year 2025. The city of León, located in the state of Guanajuato, Mexico, was known for its tranquility. The cobblestone streets, the slow rhythm of everyday life, and the welcoming atmosphere reflected the routines of its residents, most of whom lived simple lives without major disturbances. However, something dark was about to shatter this equilibrium. On February 4, 2025, Mateo Santiago Ramirez, a 12-year-old boy, vanished without a trace. What initially seemed like just another case of a child lost on the way home would soon turn into something much more unsettling. Mateo was described as an exemplary boy, responsible, studious, and well-liked by his neighbors and peers. He was the kind of child who followed a strict routine, waking up early to go to school, taking the same bus every day, returning home to study, and spending hours playing video games. There were no signs that his life was about to be interrupted in such a cruel way. His parents, Maritere and Alfredo, saw in him the promise of a bright future. But on that February day, that future would be tragically erased. By late afternoon, on February 4th, Mateo had not returned home at his usual time. When the hours passed and there was still no sign of him, Maritere grew concerned, but tried to convince herself that her son might have simply been delayed by something trivial, a conversation with a friend, or perhaps missing the bus. However, as night fell and there was still no word from Mateo, panic set in. The clock ticked on, and fear began to mount. Mateo's mother began calling his friends, asking about his whereabouts, but the answers were vague, inconclusive, as if no one knew anything. The minutes stretched on while silence descended upon the Ramirez household. The only concrete information they had was that Mateo's phone showed he was somewhere on Avenida Lázaro Cárdenas, a location far from his usual route and unfamiliar to his parents. Desperate, Mateo's parents began searching on their own, asking neighbors and local shopkeepers if they had seen him. But no one had any answers. When the police were finally called, several hours had already passed, and the disappearance was becoming more perplexing by the minute. The case quickly gained media attention, with friends and even strangers mobilizing to search for the boy. But as the days wore on, the Ramirez family's hope began to fade, replaced by an ever-deepening sense of dread. At first, law enforcement treated the case cautiously, assuming that perhaps Mateo had simply gotten lost or was delayed by some minor incident. But it soon became evident that something far more sinister was at play. Details began to emerge, and the pieces of a disturbing puzzle started to fit together, slowly but steadily. Security footage from cameras along the avenue, where Mateo typically walked home, revealed that he had not taken his usual route. He had exited the bus at a different stop, about 6 blocks from his house. There, according to a local witness, he was seen briefly talking to a friend. Afterward, he continued walking alone. No one knew where he went from there. As hours turned into days, the reports became increasingly disconcerting. The footage showed a boy who appeared, at least on the surface, to be perfectly fine. Nothing indicated that he was about to become the center of one of León's most mysterious and harrowing cases. A city that had once been calm and uneventful was now gripped by fear and uncertainty. Thus, the case of Mateo Santiago Ramirez shifted from a simple disappearance into a far more serious and widespread mystery. His photo began circulating on social media, shared by thousands, while his parents fought against the growing tides of uncertainty and pain. Each day that passed without a lead only deepened the anguish of his family. The pressure from the public was mounting, and the question hanging in the air was growing more urgent. What really happened to Mateo? What had started as a case that could have been explained away perhaps a child who got lost or ran off for some reason, was quickly evolving into a far darker and more complex mystery. And this mystery would change the lives of one family forever, as well as the peaceful town of Leon. The investigation was just beginning, but one thing was already clear. The search for answers would not be easy, and what would be revealed in Aoituidu. The coming weeks would shake the local community to its core. Mateo was an ordinary boy, with dreams and aspirations typical of his age. He wanted to grow up, study, make friends, and live his adolescence without major complications. Like many boys his age, he was passionate about video games and relished the simple, steady routine of going to school. His life, though unremarkable in its day-to-day, was marked by the joy of being with family and friends. There were no signs that anything was wrong or that he had enemies, but with each passing day, the shadow of tragedy grew ever closer. The internal conflict for the Ramirez family was palpable. What could have happened to their son? The thought of their bright and innocent Mateo being in any sort of danger was unfathomable, yet it was becoming more real with each new piece of evidence or lack thereof. Maritere and Alfredo found themselves grasping at straws, trying to make sense of the unfathomable. Days passed, and still there was no word from Mateo. It wasn't just the absence that haunted his parents, but the complete lack of answers. Were they simply overreacting, or was something truly amiss? But then, a clue emerged that would send the investigation down an unsettling path. Through the security footage, investigators saw that on the day he disappeared, Mateo did something completely out of character, something that had never happened before. He got off the bus at a different stop, about 6 blocks away from his usual drop-off point. A local taco vendor, who had seen Mateo countless times, confirmed that the boy had been chatting with a friend, just as he did every day. But soon after, the conversation ended, and Mateo continued walking alone toward the bus stop. After that, no one knew where he went. This small deviation from his routine was unsettling. It was as though Mateo had made a deliberate choice to step off course. But why? And where was he heading? The growing sense of confusion and dread was mirrored by the tension felt within the investigation. The search for Mateo, initially led by family members and neighbors, now had to rely on the police. But every lead seemed to turn into a dead end. Each passing hour, without any word from the missing boy, deepened the pain and fear of those who loved him. As the investigation intensified, the authorities began to focus their attention on one particular individual, Christian Augusto Jafed Gomez Villalpando, a 34-year-old podiatrist who lived near Mateo's school. Christian wasn't a person of interest at first. He was a quiet, reserved man who worked with diabetic patients, treating foot conditions. He was not known to have any personal connections with children or teenagers. Still, as the investigation unfolded, his name began to surface in a manner that raised suspicion. The most troubling lead came from a theory that Mateo might have visited Christian's office before he disappeared. The boy's parents vehemently denied any knowledge of such a connection, insisting that Mateo had never mentioned Christian's name. They couldn't understand how this stranger, someone they'd never heard of, could possibly be involved with their son. But the police didn't have the luxury of ignoring any possibility. As they looked deeper into Christian's background and movements, they found that his behavior in the days following Mateo's disappearance was odd, to say the least. He had failed to respond to inquiries from law enforcement, and when officers visited his clinic, they were met with an empty office, except for Christian's mother, who seemed unhelpful and evasive. This only made the authorities more suspicious. The more they dug into Christian's life, the more perplexing it became. He was a man who appeared to have no real connection to the case, but something about his actions, the secrecy, the odd refusal to cooperate, seemed to suggest that he knew more than he was letting on. As more and more attention shifted toward Christian, the community's anxiety grew. With each new report and piece of information, public pressure on the authorities intensified. The social media landscape buzzed with speculation, with people from all corners of the city offering theories, questioning motives, and demanding answers. Theories ranged from a simple misunderstanding to something far darker and more sinister. The uncertainty surrounding Mateo's disappearance made everyone uncomfortable. And the question was no longer just about where Mateo was, it was about whether he was still alive. In the midst of all this, the investigation had reached an impasse. The police were caught in a whirlwind of mounting theories and public pressure. But the one thing they knew for sure was that the last person Mateo had been seen with and the last known location of his phone were pointing them back to Christian. The Eden clock was ticking, and the investigation was becoming increasingly more urgent as the search for answers moved forward. Each passing day only deepened the doubts about Mateo's fate. Was the podiatrist involved? And if so, what role had he played in the boy's disappearance? At the heart of the investigation, the figure of Christian hung over everything, and with each new twist, the shadows of doubt and suspicion grew darker. Would the truth come to light, or would it remain buried in the silence surrounding the last moments of a boy's life? As the search continued, one thing became increasingly clear. Mateo's disappearance was not a simple case, and it was not going to be solved easily. The Ramirez family could only wait in the darkness, hoping for answers, while the authorities worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. As the investigation entered its third week, it became clear that Christian was more deeply involved in Mateo's disappearance than anyone had originally anticipated. What had initially seemed like a coincidence was now beginning to take on a much darker tone. Despite being called in for questioning, Christian repeatedly refused to cooperate with law enforcement. He failed to show up at the police station, offering the flimsy excuse that the security cameras at his office were broken. This excuse only deepened the suspicions surrounding him. The authorities were becoming increasingly frustrated by his behavior, which appeared not just evasive, but intentionally obstructive. When the police visited his clinic to investigate further, they found it completely abandoned, with Christian nowhere to be found. The only person there was his mother, who claimed she couldn't provide any additional information about her son's whereabouts or his recent activities. She seemed reluctant to speak, and her silence raised more red flags. As the investigation faltered, the Ramirez family's grief grew heavier. Every day that passed without answers only deepened their torment. The media coverage of Mateo's case intensified, and the pressure on the authorities mounted. In the public eye, a growing number of theories began to circulate, fueled by speculations on social media and in the press. Some people suggested the involvement of multiple suspects, or even a larger criminal network. Others pointed to more fantastical ideas, none of which had any real evidence to support them. Yet the police were still focused on the same lead: Christian. No concrete evidence had surfaced against him. Not yet. But then, a breakthrough came. After weeks of painstaking investigation, the authorities uncovered a critical piece of evidence. Mateo had been seen getting into a white truck, which was traced back to none other than Christian. This was the first hard piece of evidence linking the suspect to the crime. The truck, once it was identified, became the focal point of the investigation. The police tracked the vehicle's movements and found that it had traveled to a remote, isolated location, far from the city's familiar streets. What they found when they arrived was chilling. A locked gate, surrounded by an eerie stillness. There was no sign of Christian. The location felt wrong. Something was off, as if the ground itself held secrets. As the officers tried to force their way through the gate, their sense of unease grew. Christian appeared from within the property, armed, and a violent confrontation quickly escalated. He threatened to take his own life before actually injuring himself with a firearm in what appeared to be a desperate act. The standoff was over, but the damage was done. Christian was rushed to the hospital under police custody, where he was treated for his self-inflicted injuries. As he lay in the hospital bed, his fate now firmly in the hands of law enforcement, something unexpected occurred. He confessed. In a bombshell revelation, Christian admitted to abusing and murdering Mateo. His words were chilling. He had lured the boy into his truck, taken him to the secluded spot, and after a series of events, he had killed him. This confession shook the investigation to its core. It was a disturbing twist in an already horrific case, and it was a relief, in some ways, to finally have an answer. But the horror didn't stop there. Christian, still conscious but in police custody, revealed the location where he had buried Mateo's body. The authorities, now racing against time, followed the instructions he provided, and after a harrowing search, they discovered the lifeless body of Mateo Santiago Ramirez, partially buried in a remote area of land, hidden from sight. The sight of Mateo's body was both a relief for his grieving family. Finally, they would have closure, and a heartbreaking confirmation of the nightmare they had feared. The body was found, just as Christian had said, in a remote and desolate area, confirming his involvement in the young boy's tragic end. Mateo's family, who had fought so hard to keep hope alive, were now confronted with the most devastating reality. They had lost their son forever, and nothing would ever bring him back. The truth had been revealed, but it came with a pain too great to put into words. Christian's arrest, his confession, and the discovery of Mateo's body would forever change the town of Leon, leaving behind a trail of broken lives and unanswered questions. How could someone like Christian, a doctor who seemed to lead a quiet life, commit such an unimaginable crime? And what had driven him to target a boy so young and full of promise? The case had taken a dark turn, and though the investigation had reached a shocking conclusion, the impact of what had happened and the reasons behind it were far from over. The community, still reeling from the tragedy, would never be the same again. As they processed the horror, the demand for justice only grew louder. Christian had confessed, but the true scope of his actions, his motives, the pain he inflicted, was a puzzle that still needed solving. In the days to come, the public would continue to demand answers, and the courts would begin to prepare for a trial that promised to be as controversial and disturbing as the crime itself. The tragic story of Mateo Santiago Ramirez had exposed the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of what had once seemed like an ordinary, peaceful town. The revelation of Mateo's murder left the community in absolute shock, and the reactions were immediate and powerful. The city of Leon, once known for its peaceful streets and tight-knit neighborhoods, was now gripped by an overwhelming sense of outrage. Anger and disbelief swept through the town, with people unable to comprehend how a seemingly quiet, respected doctor could commit such an unspeakable crime. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a profound betrayal of trust. Authorities moved swiftly in response to the public's demand for justice. Christian was formally arrested and transferred to a detention center where he would await his trial. The weight of the evidence against him was overwhelming. His confession, the discovery of Mateo's body, and the numerous pieces of physical evidence that linked him to the crime. There was no escaping the truth. Yet, for all the public relief that justice was moving forward, the pain for Mateo's parents remained unimaginably deep. The emotional toll on them was crushing. They had not just lost their son, they had lost the future they had hoped for him. The grief was relentless, a constant ache in the heart that no justice could ever truly ease. The Ramirez family, while devastated, found some solace in the overwhelming support from their community. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers came together to offer comfort, to grieve with them, and to demand that Christian face the consequences of his actions. The social media platforms were flooded with messages of support, and protests grew louder as people around the country joined in the call for justice. However, the legal proceedings were not as straightforward as many had hoped. Christian's defense team quickly set to work, arguing that his detention had been improper, that the investigation had been rushed, and that the evidence against him was circumstantial at best. They called for the presentation of additional evidence in an attempt to cast doubt on his guilt. But the truth was indisputable. The evidence against Christian was clear and irrefutable. His confession, the white truck traced back to him, and the physical evidence found at the crime scene painted a damning portrait. There were no gray areas, no room for doubt. Christian's own words confirmed what had happened. He had stolen Mateo's life, and there was no justification for his actions. As to the trial continued to unfold, it became clear that the case had captivated the nation's attention. News outlets covered the proceedings in depth, and social media buzzed with debates about the justice system and the safety of children. The fact that a child could be so brutally harmed in such a small, seemingly safe town left the public reeling. Many questioned how it was possible for someone with Christian's background to commit such a heinous act. A trusted professional, a figure of authority, a man who had once treated patients as a healer. Across Mexico, child protection organizations spoke out in outrage. Their statements called for stronger laws, better monitoring of at-risk children, and a more effective response to cases of abduction and violence against minors. Mateo's case wasn't just about one boy. It became a symbol of how deeply society needed to address the safety of its children. It exposed the flaws in the system and the frightening reality that even the most innocuous-seeming individuals could hide dark secrets. The trial itself became a national spectacle, drawing in people from all walks of life. Supporters of Mateo's family packed the courtroom, while those who were critical of the legal system's handling of the case took to the streets in protest. With each passing day, more evidence came to light, and public sentiment shifted from shock to anger to demand for action. As the trial neared its conclusion, there was little doubt about the outcome. Christian was guilty. His confession, his actions, and the irrefutable evidence would ensure that he was held accountable. The public's desire for swift justice was clear. The case had left its mark on the collective psyche of the nation. It had underscored the vulnerability of children and the importance of vigilance, but it also served as a stark reminder of the darkness that can lie beneath the surface of even the most familiar faces. When the verdict was announced, there was a sense of closure, but it wasn't enough to erase the pain. Mateo's family, despite the outcome, could not bring their son back. The damage had been done. Christian's punishment would never be enough to undo the damage he had caused to an innocent life. In the end, Mateo Santiago Ramirez's story was one of profound loss, but also of resilience. The outpouring of support for the Ramirez family and the demand for justice transformed their tragedy into a larger conversation about justice, safety, and the rights of children in Mexico. the legacy of Mateo's case would be felt long after. The trial concluded as the country, forever changed, would remember his name, not just as a victim, but as a symbol of the fight against violence and impunity. And as for Christian, justice would come swiftly. He would face the consequences of his actions, but for the people of Leon and for Mateo's parents, true justice could never bring their son back. Mateo's story may have ended tragically, but it became a rallying cry for change. The community's demand for justice and its commitment to never forgetting Mateo Santiago Ramirez would ensure that his life and the horror of his death would not fade into oblivion. The echoes of his story would reverberate in the hearts of those who would continue the fight to protect the innocent.